As Finette said, my name's Chris Buckley. I work for the Tracing Patterns Foundation in Berkeley, in California. And I'm going to be talking about a collection of objects from the Dani people in the Baliem Valley in Papua, in New Guinea. And this is a group of people who live in a highland region of Irian Jaya on the Indonesian side of Papua. And this is the location here on a map. The Indonesian side is much less well known from an ethnographic point of view than the Papuan side, but it's a fascinating area. And the Dani people who I'm going to be talking about inhabit this upland region in a broad valley of the Baliem River at a height of about 1,500 meters. And there are several different groups in this area. It's kind of a patchwork of different ethnic groups. The ones I'm going to be focusing on are the Dani, who are also called the Hubula, who are in this peach-colored area in the center, which is a broad plain where the Baliem River meanders. And there's some excellent farming land for farming sweet potatoes and taro and keeping pigs. But all around this group, you've got other ethnic groups, and there's an extensive trading network that takes place between these various peoples. And the Dani, who used stone tools, obtained their tools by trade from the Wano people, who are off to the far left on this map. And the Yali and the Kimyal and the Una also had their own trading area on the right, the eastern side of this map. And they're interesting because they're one of the last groups to be contacted by outsiders. They had no contact with anybody from the outside world until the 1940s. And the first missionary outposts were established in the 1960s. And we were asked to take care of a collection of ethnographic material that was assembled by Dr. O.W. Hampton, known as Bud Hampton to his friends. And he visited the valley during the 1980s when the inhabitants were still using stone tools in their daily lives. He worked for the Pertamina Oil Company. He was a geologist, but he got completely fascinated by the Dani, and he essentially gave up his job and spent the next decade researching and collecting in this area. And what we've inherited, he died in 2017, and we've inherited an archive of material with around 900 objects covering all aspects of material culture. And we've also, very importantly, got his field notes, his PhD thesis, and around 20,000 photographs that he took. So not only do we have the objects, we also have the contexts, how they were used, and a lot of information about them. And as I talk through this material, I'd like to think about this question of what exactly artistic production consists of, and how will we know it when we see it. The highland groups are not usually closely associated with artistic production. The collecting activities in New Guinea have tended to focus on the lowland peoples, like the Lake Sentani area, the Sepik River, and the Asmat people down to the south. And the highland groups are less well known. But I'm going to argue in this talk that they do have a lot of interesting artistic production. And actually, the way they produce and use raises interesting questions about what art is exactly. And that's something I'll come back to later on. So we took on this collection because no museum would take on the responsibility of caring for these items and finding a new home. So we agreed to do this, and the collection eventually will go back to a museum in Papua, in Jayapura. But we've conserved it, cleaned it, and rehoused it, and also made studio photographs of most of the objects. And that work is now essentially complete, and we're preparing a catalogue of this material. And we've really got the full range of Dani material culture. So we've got a good selection of stone tools, and this was an area that Bud Hampton was particularly interested in. This is one of the adzes from this area. It was used by the Dani people for woodworking, chopping down trees, clearing fields. And one of the nice things about this archive is we've got really excellent documentation, not only of the items themselves, but how they're actually made. So this was one of the last chances to see how stone tools were made, how they were used in daily life, and the complete production process. So what you're looking at now are some of Bud Hampton's photographs. This is actually an Una man, a quarry owner called Baliem, showing the way in which he napped and produced stone blades for his adzes. And we've got the complete process from napping through to grinding on a grinding stone. And then this is an example of a Yali man hafting an adze, showing the way in which he attached the blade and then bound it with rattan. And these objects were not only work tools, they were also status symbols, and if you like, the mark of a man. And the adze was designed to balance perfectly on its owner's shoulder. So this man is also wearing a net bag over his head. He's got a hoop skirt of rattan and a very impressive penis gourd at the front there. And this is a couple of Una men chopping a tree down. And these tools were not handled in the way that Western metal axes were handled. They were a much more fragile tool than a metal axe. They were handled very carefully with very precise blows. And this is the two men chopping a tree down. And these are a couple of Dani adzes. The one on the right has been decorated by wrapping palm fiber around the handle and then smoking it over a fire and then removing the palm fiber to get this nice spiral effect. We've also got, of course, an excellent selection of net bags. And this was an essential daily use item. For the Dani, it was worn by the women. And it was not only a practical item, it was a dress item. So no woman would venture out of her house without one of these bags on. And women would wear up to 4 or 5 of these bags. And they would work in the fields and bring back produce, carry a child around in one of the bags and sweet potatoes and agricultural produce in another. And many of them are decorated to a much higher standard than the practical use of the bag would require. So this one was used by Dani people, but it was actually obtained by trade with the Yali, and it's decorated partly with stripes of ochre. These are a couple of Dani women loading a baby into one of these bags. These are a selection of mouth harps, and this was the only musical instrument that the Dani used regularly for entertainment. They also made very nice plaited armbands, and these were made exclusively by men, and they were plaited in position on the arm, so you knew you get an exact fit because it was plaited, and then it became a permanent fixture on the owner's arm. And the plaiting was done with the aid of a little bone point, and the material is a stiff fiber extracted from the stem of a fern. We've also got a large selection of bows and arrows. Hunting was not economically important for the Dani, and they got very little food by this method. But everybody loved to hunt, and most men carried a bow and arrow with them anywhere they went. And anytime there was a rustle in a tree or a bush, somebody would loose off a couple of arrows at it. And this man has got an arrow which was designed for hunting birds with 3 prongs on the end. These arrows show some of the different types that the Dani made. The one on the far left is specially designed for killing pigs for ritual purposes and for feasts. The 4 on the right are arrows for warfare. And the Dani were in regular low-level warfare with surrounding groups. And battles were conducted in the open in a kind of almost sporting atmosphere, but definitely with deadly intent. And the three arrows on the right have little strips of orchid fiber wrapped around the points. And the strips are designed to come off when they hit an enemy and lodge in the wound. And the idea is, quite frankly, to cause sepsis and hopefully death, because the strips of fiber are extremely difficult to remove from a deep wound. These are a couple of examples of cassowary feather wands, which were badges of office for the big men, the tribal leaders. And they were particularly important for battles because the chiefs would carry these wands into battle and occupy a piece of high ground, and this was their sort of mark of office. And the one on the right, the handle is wrapped around rather beautifully with bright yellow orchid fiber. This is an example of an amulet for bringing good fortune for its owner. And we have several dozens of examples of these in the Hampton Archive collection. And this one consists of three parts. You've got a mouth harp on the left, and then this peculiar thing in the middle is a moth cocoon, studded with pieces of stick, which the moth has attached to its cocoon. And on the right, you've got a tiny blade. And this is a little blade that was probably originally used in an adze when it was much larger, but it's been sharpened and resharpened until it's just a stub, at which point it was converted into a little holy amulet. And this one is wrapped in bark fiber, and it has a bast fiber looped covering, and it's decorated with a couple of red parrot feathers, and it's become an amulet which was blessed by the ritual specialist, the priest in the village, and was a good luck charm for its owner. The Dani loved to dress up, and they dressed up for feasts and festivals, and they also dressed up when they went into battle. And as raw materials for their dressing up art, they kept bird feathers and pieces of interesting fiber, and they would assemble their creations from this materials, which they kept carefully wrapped in the men's houses, where the men lived communally. And dressing up was an individual art. Each person would make his own creation from a combination of feathers, boar's tusks in this case. This guy has got a headpiece of parrot feathers, a couple of boar's tusks, a couple of dog fur armbands, and a massive bib made of NASA shells. And the shells were obtained by trade. The Dani had no idea what the sea looked like, nor any notion of where the shells might have come from. They believed they grew on trees in another part of New Guinea. And then he's also decorated his arms and legs with white clay. This is an example of a headdress made from parrot feathers. This is a very rare piece because the parrot feathers were difficult to come by and had to be obtained by trade. This is what it looked like on the head of its original owner. And it's constructed of brightly colored parrot feathers embedded in a band of looped fiber weaving, decorated with yellow orchid fiber. And ochre and clay were important parts of the decoration process. And both men and women would decorate their bodies. And this really was an art form. This is a mother decorating her daughter. And this is a woman prepared for a festival. She's a married woman, so she's got this skirt made of plaited orchid fiber, which just about balances on her hips and hangs very, very low. And her entire body is covered with this white clay paint. The thing I would like to particularly talk about today is a unique aspect of Dani art and culture, which is the wealth stones and sacred stones. These were somewhat similar to adze blades, and some of them actually were sharpened to points, but they were much larger. Some of them could be up to 1.5 meters long. They had no practical purpose. They were purely objects of wealth, for exchange, and of prestige. And they were brought out and displayed by their male owners at funerals, at weddings, and major events. And they were also rather beautifully decorated with fiber attachments, as I will show you. And we have a number of examples of these stones in the Hampton archive. This is a piece of green schist. It's about 60 centimeters long. It's got a wrapping of red and yellow orchid fiber and a streak of red ochre painted down the center. And these objects, as I say, were brought to festivals. So families would bring and display their finest stones. And at some events, particularly at funerals, stones were exchanged and given by the big men who owned them. And at funerals, they were gifted as a form of compensation for the family of the person who'd been lost. And they were displayed very carefully. They would begin with a base of either grass or palm fiber, and on top of that, they would lay several long nets like this. And then the stones would be laid out in groups of 3 or 5 or 7 on top of the nets. And then on top of the stones, they would put jerek bands, which were these bands, woven bands with cowrie shells. And these were another form of wealth and exchange. Cowrie shells were not generally exchanged loose by the Dani. They were attached to these bands, and then the bands were used as a kind of currency. And we have several, say, rather beautiful examples. These two are both wrapped in orchid fiber. The one on the right has 2 wrappings, one of yellow orchid fiber and another of like a little skirt of grass fiber. And the wide flat stones, which were the commonest type like these, seem to have had a kind of female aspect to them. So the yellow orchid fiber looks very like a female skirt. And the grass fiber skirt is the kind of skirt that young unmarried Dani women would wear. This one is another kind of a green schist. It's a stone called pibit, which was particularly sought after by the Dani. And it's decorated, it has 2 skirts, and it also has a selection of brightly colored parrot feathers. And this one has, again, 2 skirts of yellow orchid fiber and bast fiber, and a couple of boar's tusks. And when they weren't being displayed at weddings or funerals, the stones were kept in men's houses. These were the exclusive houses where the men slept and communed. And the stones were kept wrapped up in banana fiber parcels like these ones here. And the interesting thing about this is that the stones were associated with connoisseurship. And Denise O'Brien, who wrote a PhD thesis in the 1960s on the Western Dani, the Lani people, commented on this aspect. And she said that the men would take out their stones and unwrap them periodically, and compare them and evaluate their benefits and attributes. They would rub them with pig fat in order to get a high shine on them, and decorate them with various kinds of materials. And there was a real sense of appreciation of ownership and the connoisseurship of the qualities of the stones. There was a definite pecking order of the different stone types, with the greenish pibit being the most highly prized, and the grey shales that were obtained locally being further down the scale. And the value depended on the stone, its appearance, the length of the object, and the perceived beauty of the thing. And the Dani were real connoisseurs of these stones. And not only were they kept, they were also regularly brought out. They were sometimes given as gifts, as I mentioned, for compensation. And they could also be used as payments or also as compensation for wrongdoings that had been committed. And the big men accumulated the largest number of these stones. And the numbers that they owned were very closely linked with their status in the community. And there's some interesting dynamics going on here, and quite a close parallel, I think, with some aspects of Western collecting. Women also were connoisseurs of fine nets, but the stones were the exclusive preserve of men, and they were very closely linked with status. And they were concerned about the appearance, and they were concerned about gift giving, and they were concerned with the circulation of the stones within the community. And they were true connoisseurs of these objects. A very small number of the stones were selected for special consecration. These stones were imbued with the spirits of ancestors. And there were a small number of them. They were rarely seen. They were never displayed in public. But Bud Hampton developed a special relationship with the community leaders during his decade or so of working in Papua. And he got to see some of these stones and also participate in some of the ceremonies associated with them. So we're very privileged to see this material and also some of Bud's unique photographs. As far as I know, nobody else has ever photographed some of the ceremonial activities that I'm about to show you. The sacred stones could be of any type, but they tended to be of a slightly different shape. This is an oval section stone with a point at one end and a kind of blade-like finishing at the bottom end. So it's like a giant adze blade, and the aspect tends to be male rather than female on these stones. And some of them are undecorated, like this one. This is also another example of one of these ancestor stones, rather beautiful piece of schist. Some of them did have decorations like this one. This has a sort of necklace of pig's tails, and the pig's tails are souvenirs of feasts, which were carried out where the pigs were eaten by the villagers, but the pigs were offered to the ancestors, and the tails record these offering events to the spirit of the stone. And the ancestor stones were kept in special cabinets called Ganeka cabinets at the back of the men's huts. And they were typically brought out once or twice a year, never brought out in the open in public, but kept within the men's houses. And they were associated with ceremonies for asking for support from the ancestors' spirits. Some of the stones were inhabited by the spirits of great warriors. So before a battle, for example, a special ceremony would be conducted to ask for the assistance of these warrior spirits. And Hampton was privileged to see a couple of these ceremonies, and each one, the stones were unwrapped, carefully anointed with pig fat, and then a little brass band called a dibat would be attached to the stone. And this stone here, in its bark fiber wrappings, has dozens or perhaps 100 of these bands, and each grass fiber wrapping represents one ceremony. So this stone has probably been in use for 100 years or more. And in the collection, we've got several examples of these sacred ancestor stones in their original wrappings. So this is one, what it looks like in its wrapped form, wrapped in bast fiber, tree bast, and then a plaited band. And unwrapped, it looks like this. So we have the ancestor stone in the middle, a couple of boar's tusks, 2 cowrie shells, and a pair of pig's tails. We also have an example of an ancestor stone from the Yali people, who are a little bit off to the east. They also had ancestor stones, but they were somewhat different to the Dani ones. Much less is known about these than the Dani examples. And this one is painted with ochre, and it's oddly reminiscent of some stones from Australia called Chiringa stones, which are also pretty mysterious in terms of their functions. This is another example of an ancestor stone in its complete wrapping in the Hampton archive. And this one, the stone has a little kind of stone pillow of an unusually shaped natural stone that it rests on. It's got boar's tusks, a little fiber skirt, and pig's tails. And then around it, there are various other talismanic objects, a bamboo knife with a wrapping around its handle, several boar's tusks, and a couple of ammonite fossils. And then on the extreme right, there's a feather, and the feather was kept on the outside of the bundle. And its purpose is for waving over the hands of somebody who'd handled the stone, because the stone is full of spiritual energy. And the spiritual energy is neutral in character. It can be either useful or it can also be harmful. So the feather is there to cleanse the hands of excess spiritual power. That is the bulk of my talk now. I'm going to point you at this article in Tribal Art magazine, which I'm sure some of you get, which talks a little bit more about the stones in the collection. I found the experience of working on this material absolutely fascinating. And as I say, it's made me rethink what I understood about art and collecting. And what the Dani, I think, are showing me is that art is as much an activity as it is a thing. You know, we tend to focus on art as objects, as sculpture, but what the Dani are showing us is that it's in one aspect an expressive art. Their body painting and their feather decorations are purely individual expressionistic art forms. And on the other hand, it's a matter of connoisseurship amongst particular elite groups. And I think in this aspect, there are some very interesting parallels with Western collecting. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Well, thank you, Christopher. It was